History of the World by J.M. Roberts. Book 1 Before History Beginnings. Chapter 2 Homo sapiens. For all the splendor of this art, we know little about its collapse. The light is never more than dim in the upper Paleolithic, and the darkness closes in rapidly, which is to say, of course, over thousands of years. Nevertheless, the impression left by the violence of the contrast between what was before and what came after produces a sense of shock. So, relatively sudden an extinction is a mystery. We have no precise dates or even precise sequences. Nothing ended in one year or another. There was only a gradual closing down of artistic activity over a long time, which seems in the end to have been absolute. Some scholars have blamed climate. Perhaps, they argue, the whole phenomenon of cave art was linked to efforts to influence the movements or abundance of the great game herds on which the hunting peoples relied. As the last ice age ebbed and each year the reindeer retreated a little, men sought new and magical techniques to manipulate them. But gradually, as the ice sheets withdrew more and more, an environment to which they had successfully adapted disappeared. As it did, so did the hope of influencing nature. Homo sapiens was not powerless, far from it. He could adapt and did to a new challenge. But for a time, one cultural impoverishment, at least, the abandonment of his first art, was a consequence of adaptation. It is easy to see much that is fanciful in such speculation, but difficult to restrain excitement over such an astonishing achievement. People have spoken of the great cave sequences as cathedrals of the Paleolithic world. And such metaphors are justified if the level of the achievement and the scale of the work undertaken is measured against what evidence we have of the earlier triumphs of man. With the first great art, the hominids are now left far behind, and we have unequivocal evidence of the power of the human mind. Much else that is known of the Upper Paleolithic confirms the sense that the crucial genetic changes are behind and that evolution is now a mental and social phenomenon. The distribution of major racial divisions in the world, which last down to every early modern times, is already broadly fixed by the end of the Upper Paleolithic. Geographical and climatic divisions had produced specializations within Homo sapiens in skin pigmentation, hair characteristics, the shape of the skull, and the bone structure of the face. In the earliest Chinese relics of Homo sapiens, the Mongoloid characteristics are discernible. All the main racial groups are established by 10,000 BC, broadly speaking, in the areas they dominated until the great resettlement of the Caucasian stocks, which was one aspect of the rise of European civilization to world domination after 1500 AD. The world was filling up during the Old Stone Age. Men at last penetrated the virgin continents. Somewhere between 30 and 15,000 years ago, Mongoloid peoples spread over the Americas. The earliest Australian Paleolithic site has been dated about 35,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens probably reached that continent by water transport from Southeast Asia. Yet, the Upper Paleolithic world was still a very empty place. Calculations suggest that 20,000 humans lived in France in Neanderthal times, possibly 50,000 20 millennia ago. There were then perhaps 10 million humans in the whole world. A human desert swarming with game is one scholar's description of it. They lived by hunting and gathering, and a lot of land was needed to support a family. However questionable such figures may be, if they are agreed to be of this order of magnitude, it is not hard to see that they still mean very slow cultural change. Greatly accelerated though man's progress in the old Stone Age may be, and much more versatile though he is becoming, he is still taking thousands of years to transmit his learning across the barriers of geography and social division. A man might, after all, live all his life without meeting anyone from another group or tribe, let alone another culture. The divisions which already existed between different groups of Homo sapiens open a historical era whose whole tendency was towards the cultural distinction, if not isolation, of one group from another, and this was to increase human variety until reversed by technical and political forces in very recent times. About the groups in which Upper Paleolithic man lived, there is still much unknown. What is clear is that they were both larger in size than in former times and also more settled. The earliest remains of buildings come from the hunters of the Upper Paleolithic who inhabited what are now the Czech and Slovak republics and southern Russia. In about 10,000 BC, in parts of France, some clusters of shelters seem to have contained anything from 4 to 600 people. But judging by the archaeological record, this was unusual. Something like the tribe probably existed, therefore, though about its organization and hierarchies, it is virtually impossible to speak. All that is clear is that there was a continuing sexual specialization in the Old Stone Age as hunting grew more elaborate and its skills more demanding, while settlements provided new possibilities of vegetable gathering by the women. Cloudy though its picture is, nonetheless, the earth at the end of the Old Stone Age is an important respects one we can recognize. There were still to be geological changes. The English Channel was only to make its latest appearance in about 7000 BC, for example. But we have lived in a period of comparative topographical stability which has preserved the major shapes of the world of about 9000 BC. The world was already firmly man's world. The descendants of the primates who came out of the trees had, by the acquisition of their tool making skills, by using natural materials to make shelters, and by domesticating fire, by hunting and exploiting other animals, long achieved an important measure of independence of natural rhythms. This had brought them to a high enough level of social organization to undertake important cooperative works. Their needs had provoked economic differentiations between the sexes. Grappling with these and other material problems had led to the transmission of ideas by speech, to the invention of ritual practices and ideas which lie at the roots of religion, and eventually to a great art. It has even been argued that Upper Paleolithic man had a lunar calendar. Man, as he leaves prehistory, is already a conceptualizing creature, equipped with intellect, with the power to objectify and abstract. It is very difficult not to believe that it is this new strength which explains man's capacity to make the last and greatest stride in prehistory, the invention of agriculture. Chapter 3, The Possibility of Civilization. Homo sapiens has existed for at least 10 and perhaps 20 times as long as the civilization he has created. The waning of the last ice age allowed the long march to civilization to be completed and is the immediate prelude to history. Within 5 or 6,000 years, a succession of momentous changes took place. The most important of them was an increase in food supply. Nothing so sharply accelerated human development or had such widespread results until the changes called Industrial Revolution, which have been going on for the last 2.5 centuries. One scholar summed up these changes, which make the end of prehistory, with a similar phrase: the Neolithic Revolution. Here is another little tangle of potentially misleading terminology, though the last we need consider in prehistory. Archaeologists follow the Paleolithic era by the Mesolithic and that by the Neolithic. Some add a fourth, the Chalcolithic, by which they mean a phase of society in which artifacts of stone and copper are in simultaneous use. The distinction between the first two is really of moment only to the specialist, but all these terms describe cultural facts. They identify sequences of artifacts which show growing resources and capacities. Only the term Neolithic need concern us. It means, at its strictest, a culture in which ground or polished stone tools replace chipped ones, though other criteria are sometimes added to this. This may not seem so startling a change as to justify the excitement over the Neolithic, which has been shown by some prehistorians far less talk of Neolithic revolution. In fact, though, the phrase is still sometimes used. It is unsatisfactory because it has had to cover too many different ideas. Nonetheless, it was an attempt to pin down an important and complex change which took place with many local variations, and it is worthwhile to try to assess its general significance. We can start by noting that even in the narrowest technological sense, the Neolithic phase of human development does not begin, flower, or end everywhere at the same time. In one place, it may last thousands of years longer than in other, and its beginnings are separated from what went before not by a clear line but by a mysterious zone of cultural change. Then, within it, not all societies possess the same range of skills and resources. Some discover how to make pottery as well as polished stone tools. Others go on to domesticate animals and begin to gather or raise cereal crops. Slow evolution is the rule, and not all societies had reached the same level by the time literate civilization appears. Nevertheless, Neolithic culture is the matrix from which civilization appears and provides the preconditions on which it rests, and they are by no means limited to the production of the highly finished stone tools which gave the phase its name. We must also qualify the word revolution when discussing this change. Though we leave behind the slow evolutions of the Pleistocene and move into an accelerating era of prehistory, there are still no clear cut divisions. They are pretty rare in later history. Even when they try to do so, few societies ever break with their past. What we can observe is a slow but radical transformation of human behavior and organization over more and more of the world, not a sudden new departure. It is made up of several crucial changes which make the last period of prehistory identifiable as a unity, whatever we call it. At the end of the Upper Paleolithic, man existed physically much as we know him. He was, of course, still to change somewhat in height and weight, most obviously in those areas of the world where he gained in stature and life expectancy as nutrition improved. In the Old Stone Age, It was unlikely that a man or a woman would reach an age of 40, and if they did, then they were likely to live pretty miserable lives. In our eyes, prematurely aged, tormented by arthritis, rheumatism, and the casual accidents of broken bones or rotting teeth. This would only slowly change for the better. The shape of the human face would go on evolving too as diet altered. It seems to be only after 1066 AD that the edge to edge bite gave way among Anglo Saxons to the overbite, which was the ultimate consequence of a shift to more starch and carbohydrates, a development of some importance for the later appearance of the English. The physical types of men differed in different continents, but we cannot presume that capacities did. In all parts of the world, Homo sapiens sapiens was showing great versatility in adapting his heritage to the climatic and geographical upheavals of the ebbing phase of the last ice age. In the beginnings of settlements of some size and permanence, in the elaboration of technology and in the growth of language and the dawn of characterization of art, lay some of the rudimentary elements of the compound which was eventually to crystallize as civilization. But much more than these were needed. Above all, there had to be the possibility of some sort of economic surplus to daily requirements. This was hardly conceivable except in occasional, specially favorable areas of the hunting and gathering economy which sustained all human life and was the only one known to human beings until about 10,000 years ago. What made it possible was the invention of agriculture. The importance of this was so great that it does seem to justify a strong metaphor and the farming revolution or food gathering revolution are terms whose meanings is readily clear. They single out the fact which explains why the Neolithic era could provide the circumstances in which civilizations could appear. Even a knowledge of metallurgy, which was spreading in some societies during their Neolithic phases, is not so fundamental. Farming truly revolutionized the conditions of human existence, and it is the main thing to bear in mind when considering the meaning of Neolithic, a meaning once concisely summarized as a period between the end of the hunting way of life and the beginning of a full metal using economy, when the practice of farming arose and spread through most of the Europe, Asia, and North Africa like a slow moving wave. The essentials of agriculture are the growing of crops and the practice of animal husbandry. How these came about and at what places and times is more mysterious. Some environments must have helped more than others, while some peoples pursued game across plains uncovered by the retreating ice. Others were intensifying their skills needed to exploit the new, prolific river valleys and coastal inlets rich in edible plants and fish. The same must be true of cultivation and herding. On the whole, the old world of Africa and Eurasia was better off in domesticable animals than what would later be called the Americas. Not surprisingly, then, agriculture began in more than one place and in different forms. It seems likely that the earliest instance based on the cultivation of primitive forms of millet and rice occurred in Southeast Asia somewhere about 10,000 BC. Yet, because of what was to happen later, the accidents of historical survivals, and the direction taken by scholarly efforts, much more is known about early agriculture in the Near East than about its possible precursors in the Far East. There are good reasons for continuing to regard it as a crucial zone, even if it is not given pride of place in terms of chronology. Both the predisposing conditions and the evidence point to the region later called the Fertile Crescent as specially significant. The whole arc of territory running northward from Egypt through Palestine and the Levant and through Anatolia to the hills between Iran and the South Caspian to enclose the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Much of it now looks very different from the same area's lush landscape when the climate was at its best 5,000 or so years ago. Wild barley and wheat like cereal then grew in southern Turkey and emmer, a wild wheat in the Jordan Valley. Egypt enjoyed enough rain for the hunting of big game, while into historical times, and elephants were still to be found in the Syrian forests in 1000 BC. The whole region today is fertile by comparison with the desert which its boundaries. But in prehistoric times, it was even more favored. The cereal grasses, which the ancestors of later crops have been traced back furthest in these lands. There is evidence of the harvesting, though not necessarily of cultivating, of wild grass in Asia Minor in about 9500 BC. There too, the afforestation, which followed the end of the last ice age, seems to have presented a manageable challenge. Population pressure might well have been stimulated. Attempts to extend living space by clearing and planting when hunting gathering areas became overcrowded. From this region, the new foods and the new techniques for the planting and harvesting them seem to have spread into Europe in about 6000 BC. Within the region, of course, contacts were relatively easier than outside it. A date as early as 8000 BC has been given to discoveries of bladed tools found in southwest Iran, but made from obsidian, which came from Anatolia. But diffusion need not have been the only process at work. Agriculture later appeared in the Americas, seemingly without any import of techniques from outside. The jump from gathering wild cereals to planting and harvesting them seems marginally greater than that from driving game from hunting to herding. But the domestication of animals was almost as momentous. The first traces of the keeping of sheep came from northern Iraq in about 9000 BC. Over such hilly grassy areas, the wild forebears of the Jersey cow and the Sussex white pig roamed untroubled for thousands of years except by occasional contact with their hunters. Pigs, it is true, could be found all over the Old World, but sheep and goats were specially plentiful in Asia Minor and a region running across much of Asia itself. From their systematic exploitation would follow the control of their breeding and other economic and technological innovations. The use of skins and wool opened new possibilities. The taking of milk launched dairying. Riding and the use of animals for traction would come later. So would domestic poultry. The story of mankind is now far past the point at which the impact of such changes can be easily grasped. Suddenly, with the coming of agriculture and the whole material fabric on which subsequent human history was to be based, flashes into view, though not into existence. It began with greatest of man's transformations of the environment. In a hunting gathering society, thousands of acres are needed to support a family, whereas in primitive agricultural society, about 25 acres is enough. In terms of population growth alone, a huge acceleration became possible. An assured or virtually assured food surplus also meant settlements of a new solidity. Bigger populations could live on smaller areas and true villages could appear. Specialists not engaged in food production could be tolerated and fed more easily while they practiced their own skills. Before 9000 BC, there was a village and perhaps a shrine at Jericho. 1,000 years later, it had grown to some 8 to 10 acres of mud brick houses with substantial walls. It is a long time before we can discern much of the social organization and behavior of such communities. It seems possible that at this time, as much as at any other, local divisions of mankind were decisive. Physically, it grappled with different problems and appropriated different resources. The adaptability of different branches of Homo sapiens in the conditions left behind after the retreat of the last ice age is very striking and produced variations in experience, unlike those following earlier glaciations. They lived for the most part in isolated, settled traditions, in which the importance of routine was overwhelming. This would give new stability to the divisions of culture and race, which had appeared to grow slowly throughout the Paleolithic times. It would take much less time in the historical future, which lay ahead for these local peculiarities to crumble under the impact of population growth, speedier communication, and the coming of trade, a mere 10,000 years at most. Within the new farming communities, it seems likely that distinctions of role multiplied and new collective disciplines had to be accepted. For some people, there must have been more leisure, though for others, actually engaged in the production of food, leisure may well be diminished. It certainly seems likely that social distinctions became more marked. This may be connected with new possibilities as surpluses became available for barter, which led eventually to trade. The same surpluses may also have encouraged man's oldest sport after hunting, warfare. New prizes must have made raids and conquest more tempting. Perhaps, too, a conflict which was to have centuries of vitality before it finds its origins here, that between nomads and settlers. Political power may have its origin in the need to organize protection for crops and stock from human predators. We may even speculate that the dim roots of the notion of aristocracy are to be sought in the successes which must have been frequent of hunter gatherers, representatives of an older social order in exploiting the vulnerability of the settlers tied to the areas of cultivation by enslaving them. Hunting was long to be the sport of kings, and mastery of the animal world was an attribute of the heroes of whose exploits we have records in sculpture and legend. Nonetheless, though the just prehistoric world must have been lawless and brutal, it is worth remembering that there was an offsetting factor. The world was still not very full. The replacement of hunter gatherers by farmers did not have to be a violent process. The ample space and thin populations of Europe on the eve of the introduction of farming may explain the lack of archaeological evidence of struggle. It was only slowly that growing populations and pressures on the new farming resources increased the likelihood of competition. In the long run, metallurgy changed things as much as did farming, but it was to be a very much longer run. Immediately, it made a less rapid and fundamental difference. This is probably because the deposits of ore first discovered were few and scattered. For a long time, there was not just much metal around, the first of whose use we find evidence is copper, which rather weakens the attractiveness of the old term Bronze Age for the beginning of metal using culture. At some time between 6000 and 7000 BC, it was being hammered into shape with heating at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, though the earliest known metal artifacts date from about 4000 BC and are beaten copper pins found in Egypt. Once the technique of blending copper with tin, which was in use in Mesopotamia soon after 3000 BC to produce bronze, was discovered, a metal was available which was both relatively easy to cast and retained a much better cutting edge. On this much could be built, from it much derived. Among other results, the quite new importance of ore bearing areas. In its turn, this was to give a new twist to trade, to the markets, and to routes. Further complications, of course, followed the coming of iron, which appeared after some cultures had indisputably evolved into civilizations. Another reflections of the way in which the historical and prehistoric eras run so untidily into one another. Its obvious military value springs to eye, but it had just as much importance when turned into agricultural tools. This is looking a long way ahead, but it made possible a huge extension of living space and food production soil. However, successfully he burned woodland and scrub Neolithic man could only scratch at heavy soils with an antler or wooden pick. Turning them over and digging deep began to be possible only when the invention of plowing in the Near East in about 3000 BC brought animal muscle power to the assistance of human and when iron tools became common. It is already clear how quickly the term is legitimate against background of earlier prehistory, even if it takes thousands of years in some places. Interpenetration and interplay begin to influence the pace and direction of change. Long before the processes have exhausted their effects in some areas too, the first civilizations are in being. Prehistorians used to argue whether innovations were diffused from a single source or appeared spontaneously and independently in different spaces. But so complex a background has made this seem a waste of time and energy. Both views, if put forward in an unqualified way, seem untenable. To say that in one place and in one place only, all the conditions for the appearance of the new phenomena existed and that these were then simply diffused elsewhere is as implausible as saying that in widely differing circumstances of geography, climate, and cultural inheritance, exactly the same inventions could be thrown up, as it were, time and time again. What we can observe is a concentration of factors in the Near East which made it at one crucial moment immeasurably the most evident, active, and important center of the new developments. It does not mean that similar individual developments may not have occurred elsewhere. Pottery, it seems, was first produced in Japan in about 10,000 BC, and agriculture evolved in Americas perhaps as early as 5000 BC in complete isolation from the Old World. This means that the prologue to human history comes to an end in ragged, untidy way once again. There is no neat dividing line. At the end of prehistory and on the eve of the first civilizations, we can discern a world of human societies more differentiated than ever before and more successful than ever in mastering different environments and surviving. Some will continue into history. It is only within the last century or so that the Ainos of the northern Japan have disappeared, taking with them a life that is said to have been very similar to one they lived 15,000 years ago. Englishmen and Frenchmen who went to North America in the 16th century AD found hunter gatherers there who must have lived much as their own ancestors had 10,000 years before. Plato and Aristotle were to live and die before prehistory in America gave way to the appearance of the great Maya civilization of Yucatan, and prehistory lasted for Eskimos and Australian Aborigines until the 19th century. No crude division of chronology, therefore, will help in unraveling so interwoven a pattern, but its most important feature is clear enough. By 6000 or 5000 BC, there existed in at least one area of the world all the essential constituents of civilized life. Their deepest roots lay hundreds of thousands of years further back, in ages dominated by the slow rhythm of genetic evolution. Through the Upper Paleolithic eras, the pace of change has quickened by a huge factor as culture slowly became more important, but this was as nothing to what was to follow. Civilization was to bring conscious attempts on a quite new scale to control and organize men and their environment. It builds on the basis of cumulative mental and technological resources, and the feedback from its own transformations further accelerates the process of change. Ahead lies faster development in every field, in the technical control of environment, in the elaboration of mental patterns, in the changing of social organization, in the accumulation of wealth, in the growth of population. It is important to get our perspective in this matter right. From some modern point of view, the centuries of the European Middle Ages look like a long slumber. No medievalist would agree, of course, but a 20th century man would who is impressed by the rapidity of the change which encompasses him and the relative immobility of medieval society ought to reflect that the art which develops from the Romanesque of Charlemagne's Aachen to the flamboyant of 15th century France was revolutionized in 5 or 6 centuries. In a period about 10 times as long, the first known art, that of Upper Paleolithic Europe, shows, by comparison, insignificant stylistic change. Further back, the pace is even slower as the long persistence of early tools types show. Still, more fundamental changes are even less easy to comprehend. So far as we know, the last 12,000 years registered nothing new in human physiology comparable to the colossal transformations of the early Pleistocene, which are registered for us in a handful of relics of a few of nature's experiments. Yet, those took hundreds of thousands of years. In part, the contrast is the with which we began, that between nature and man as markers of change. Man increasingly chooses for himself, and even in prehistory, the story of change is therefore increasingly one of conscious adaptation. So the story will continue into historical times more intensively still. This is why most important part of the story of man is the story of consciousness. When long ago it broke the genetic slow march, it made everything else possible. Nature and nurture are there from the moment that man is first identifiable. Perhaps they can never be quite disentangled, but man made culture and tradition are increasingly the determinants of change. Two reflections ought nonetheless to be made to balance this indisputable fact. The first is that man has almost certainly not shown any improvement in the innate capacity since the Upper Paleolithic. His physique has not changed fundamentally in 40,000 years or so, and it would be surprising if his mental capacity has done so. So short a time could hardly suffice for genetic changes comparable to those of earlier eras. Rapidity with which humanity has achieved so much since prehistory times can be accounted for quite simply. There are many more of us upon whose talents humanity can draw, and more important still, human achievements are essentially cumulative. The rest upon a heritage itself, accumulating at, as it were, compound interest. Primitive societies had far less inherited advantage in the bank. This makes the magnitude of their greatest steps forward all the more amazing. If this is speculative, the second reflection need not be. Man's genetic inheritance not only enables him to make conscious change, to undertake an unprecedented kind of evolution, but also controls and limits him. The irrationalities of this century show the narrow limits of man's capacity for conscious control of his destiny. To this extent, he is still determined, still unfree, still a part of nature, which produced his unique qualities in the first place, only by evolutionary selection. It is not easy to separate this part of his inheritance either from the emotional shaping he has achieved from the processes through which he evolved. That shaping still lies deep at the heart of all our aesthetic and affective life. Man must live with an inbuilt dualism. To deal with it has been the aim of most of the great philosophies and religions and the mythologies by which we still live, but they are themselves molded by it. As we move from prehistory to history, it is important not to forget that its determining effect still proves much more restrained to control than those blind prehistoric forces of geography and climate, which were so quickly overcome. Nevertheless, man at the edge of history is already the creature we know, man, the change maker.